Hello, friends. Welcome to the program here with the Wendland-Cook Program in Religion and Justice. My name is Francisco Garcia, and I am Graduate Research Fellow at the Wendland-Cook Program. And we're delighted to have with us today an international renowned theologian and also a scholar, activist, and active leader in global ecumenical and interreligious movements, Dr. Ulrich Duchrow, who serves as a professor of systematic theology at the University of Heidelberg. Although, as we'll get into this conversation, Professor Duchrow is very much not confined to that space, and is very active in social movements and in interdisciplinary conversations to help really give theology the way, boots on the ground, so to speak, and give it the real prophetic edge that I believe is needed. And so, Professor Duchrow, thank you for joining us today for this conversation.
Pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
And I guess we can begin by talking about what are some of those current projects that you're involved in? As you know, I know that you and our founding director of Wendland-Cook, Dr. Joerg Rieger, are longtime colleagues, and certainly it's been an honor to read some of your work in his courses. But I know that your work takes you in all kinds of different directions: ecumenical conversations, interreligious conversations, discussions with NGOs and social movements. What is it that you are most excited about now in terms of your projects?
Okay, thank you for the question. I thought it might be interesting for you and those who listen to tell you my basic frame in which I'm operating.
Yes.
I did a lot of studies concerning what is called the actual age. It's a term coined by the philosopher Karl Jaspers. And it is the time between just roughly 8th century before Common Era and Roman Empire.
Yes.
And the key question in that for me was what is the socio-historic basis for the development of religions in that period, and that concerns religions and philosophies, and that concerns Greece, Judah, because Israel was just disappearing at that early stage, and then Judah, India, and China. So a development in that whole area is comparable. And the old history, ancient history research found out that this is linked to the entrance of money into the daily economy. I mean, before that, money was a counting unit and also related to foreign trade, but it was not really affecting the local communities. So the basic understanding of that is that very soon came a kind of tendency to use money for wealth creation instead of just being an instrument for dealing with division of labor, kind of questions. So what I call the money accumulation economy started at that point in various phases through history. I mean, until the Roman Empire in the form of treasure and also latifundia, development based on slave labor. And then as of the 11th century, starting in Upper Italy, early capitalism just built on trade and usury capital. But then in the modern times, coming to industrial capital, etc., and now we have financial and digital capital, etc. So I see that whole development as one civilization, driven by this accumulation forces.
Yes.
Which at the same time, in terms of your basic issue, labor, means trying to reduce costs of labor and also costs of nature, which of course today is very important to understand. So the new thing today is that this cannot continue. So this civilization as is at its end. Why? Because accumulation of capital drives economy into a kind of compulsory growth.
Yes.
And compulsory growth, everybody should know that these days, is driving the planet into death. At least as far as human and living beings life is concerned. We cannot really, develop all this, but everybody should know this by now. And so the key question, therefore, is about how to stop the accumulation, compulsory accumulation, which is the key element of capitalism in this later stage of the civilization, and how to develop what I call economy of life. Not only I call it, but we have worked on that for 30 years under that title. So this is just the framework I think is important to understand, because then the details fall into place.
Yes, I know it's a very important framework. So thank you for beginning with that. And in fact, in your book that you co-authored with Franz Hinkelemert, you articulate this
yes,
very powerfully. And can you speak a little bit then to how religion then has been implicated in that process in terms of the accumulation of wealth?
Right. Of course, we are now talking in very broad terms.
Yes.
Of course, we could go into all the details, but I think it is important also to see the grand picture, because then the different things fall into place. So what is happening in that early phase of actual age is that in philosophy and religion, on the one hand, the money mechanisms are mirrored. And you have the key example of this is you call it pre-Socratic philosophy, being developed exactly 20 years after the coins were invented in the area of the present-day Turkey by Lydia, and then coming to the coast of Turkey of today in a polis called Milet. And Miletus is the first monetarized polis. And exactly in that context, you have the pre-Socratic philosophy developing, Thales, Anaximander, etc., Heraclit. And Heraclit expresses this they understood money, the one in the many. And the one they understood in terms of a substance. It must be some substance penetrating everything. And so Thales thought it was the water, Anaximander thought it was the air, and Heraclit said it is fire. And so he says, fire is in everything like gold in the commodities. So he is directly expressing that linkage of experiencing the reality of money in the many. Now, but at the same time, you feel the bad consequences of the money accumulation in terms of particularly debt mechanisms. And so you have also counter actions in that area. For instance, Solon abolishing debt slavery, in essence. But the main thing is the tragedies. The tragedies are dealing with the money issue in terms of the tyrant. The tyrant is the money subject, katexochen, because he thinks he is independent because of his wealth of all the rest and can dominate everything. So this is a very interesting question. And the main researcher who has fantastic work on that is Richard Seaford in Exeter, Britain. And Richard has also then studied for 10 years Indian languages in order to understand the parallel thing in India. So he has now a new book on the origins of philosophy in Greece and India. And then also in China, you have Lao Tse and Confucius, who are dealing with the consequences of that money experience. I cannot go into the detail. By the way, I did a later study on this, which is implicated in the second English edition, which you do not have, which is, so to speak, informal as basis for the Korean translation. Yeah. So there is another chapter. If you don't have that, I can. Joerg should have it, but I can send it to you so that we have the full picture from Greece. And of course, now I forgot Judah in the middle, and here you have a new, very interesting debate on monotheism as being a baby of the one in the many idea of money. And there is a new book on that. Schaperl is the name, by the way, written in English, although he's a German, which is called the media in this whole development of the media and monotheism is the title. Schaperl is the name of the researcher. And I've also written, I have some critique also of this book. I can send you the review of that book. Sure. If you are interested. So, but here but in Judah, you have the not the mirroring mainly, but you have the counteraction. So the one is not the money god, that is called an idol, but the one is the compassionate, the liberator, the slave liberator, the God of justice. Right. So the Judah in that time, I mean, Amos is the first, and then the prophets. Then it's also later encapsulated in the Torah with all the social laws, etc., etc. So I mean, so you have in all these areas, you have reactions. One I should also mention, that is Buddha, the Buddha. Yes. The Buddha analyzes the problem of suffering being caused by three poisons, and the poisons being greed, hatred or defense of your ownership, and illusion, the illusion which goes along with money, all money-related poisons. Yes. And then, of course, he reacts to this by what we would call just relations. I mean, to see that everything is interconnected, and yes, by compassion, you participate in a solidarity interaction within the whole. So this is just in very brief. And my thesis is that, of course, although religions always can be turned in its opposite in terms of power co-opting religion, and you find that throughout history, and particularly also Christian history and Jewish history now, in terms of Israel. Yes. This is a counter Judaism in a way, because it just builds on violence and not on justice. And so, so in that sense, you can see the alienation of religion, but always you also find those elements of counteracting the mechanisms of injustice inherent in the money accumulating civilization.
Yes. Yeah, and actually that leads me to this a quote from the book that I wanted to read to you and then ask for your thoughts on it now. You know, towards the end of Transcending Greedy Money, you identify you know, lots of different sort of aspects in terms of alternatives for a political economy of what can work. But you also look to building interreligious solidarity, and you identify signs of hope for what could be a new axial age. And so here this is a quote from that section. As a consequence of the capitalist imperial system, every society, every humanity, and Earth as a whole is faced with the question of survival. If we want to discover signs of hope for a new axial age, we therefore need to look for interreligious contributions to local, national, regional, and global struggles for a new life culture in just relations. So it sort of draws together what you've just been talking about.
Yes.
What does it look like to create just relations, and what are the mechanisms that we need in terms of the different faiths and the cooperation that is needed for a different economy. And so in some of those sections, you referenced the World Council of Churches and the World Social Forum, the World Alliance of Reformed Churches. And I was just thinking that in terms of you know, this global pandemic that we are now, you know, moving into the end of year 2, probably going into the 3rd year of this, certain forms of organization, like, you know, the World Social Forum, for a good many years, was a very significant, powerful gathering of many people, and it seems that maybe this pandemic has hindered that. Although there are other forms of organization that emerge, you know, obviously through the power of Zoom and other technologies. So I just wanted to get your take on this quote that I shared with you, and
Yes.
And your thoughts on what are the signs that we're looking to now?
Okay. Well, first of all, I think it is very important with the foundation of your question to see this pandemic as part of the problem, as a kind of menetekel at the wall. You know that Naomi Klein, I'm sure you know her and her work, just a few years ago wrote a book called Disaster Capitalism.
Yes.
Yes. And in Germany, it is the capitalism of catastrophe, catastrophe.
Mm-hmm.
So we call it Katastrophenkapitalismus in German. What she says, disaster capitalism. And I see this pandemic as the beginning of the catastrophes of the capitalist civilization, which I alluded to in the beginning, so that we will not get to an end of it. Because it will build up more and more, because everybody knows the pandemic is because of robbing wild animals of their space. So it is this accumulation, this expansionism of capitalism, which eats up, literally eats up the land, the landscape, etc. So in order to somehow produce money out of real material. So in that sense, this is a very, very important aspect. And people should stop saying we want to get back to normal.
Yes.
You may know the statement of Walter Benjamin, a philosopher. The norm and the continuation of the normal, this is the catastrophe. So therefore, I think this is the first thing in relation to your question we should be clear about. It will not end, it will be more of catastrophe if we do not change the ways of our life, and particularly, of course, structure of our economy, etc. We can talk about that later in terms of what the key points for change should be. But anyhow, this is the first thing which is extremely important. Now, as the domination, I mean, the ruling powers of this age is the financial markets, particularly the big financial investor organizations, BlackRock, etc. Huh? Yeah. You know that now the president of the Christian Democrats in Germany before was the head of BlackRock Germany.
Oh, wow.
I always say Germany is now, if he gets chancellor ever, Germany will be sold out to BlackRock.
Wow.
Yeah, it's terrible. I mean, but people do not really look through, and so it's because he seems to be that kind of self-confident and big shot, huh? But I mean, what can you expect of a former BlackRock CEO as chancellor of a country like Germany? It's a nightmare for me. Okay, anyway.
I know, just you mentioned BlackRock, and you know, there are connections with issues in the United States in terms of the investments they have in housing, and so
yeah.
and a lot of the proliferation of luxury housing that has displaced many working class immigrant communities of color in large cities in Los Angeles and other areas owned by BlackRock.
Yes, and we have 30 companies in our stock market, DAX. In all of them, BlackRock has important stock, what do you call it, ownership.
Yes.
Yes, so it's like an octopus. Anyway, so you have this in the background, or this is somehow the question of domination. Now, therefore, you cannot expect the changes necessary from governments, because these ruling powers have the governments as hostages. You can see that now in Germany, the so-called free Democrats, they are just market fundamentalists. And they have already now, in the whole question of the three parties building the coalition, they have key elements which are against social justice and against ecological sustainability. But I cannot go into this, but just only to mention that. So therefore, and now I come to your question, the key question is that within civil society, you build strong alliances between the different forces for survival of humanity. Now, within those alliances, we hopefully have strong participation from these different religions. Now, I do not repeat what I have written in that book, you know, all these things that I should just mention for those who have not read it. We started, I mean, of course, it was work in the international church organizations, particularly since mid-60s.
Yes.
The 1966 was the Geneva Conference on Church and Society. It was the first time that the so-called Third World, particularly also liberation theology from Latin America, took over the leadership in the World Council. So that was a key year, 66. Now, since 83, we were starting to systematically organize work on the economy issue as the key issue of justice, peace, integrity of creation. So starting in 83, the World Council in 1990 somehow left this field and just looked at the local issues. Mm-hmm. But the World Alliance of Reformed Churches started what was called a processus confessionis on justice, on economic injustice and destruction of nature. They started, the whole 90s were crucial for that. Now, in 98, we had the World Council of Churches meet in Harare, and the General Secretary of the World Alliance of Reformed Churches, and we were three people then proposing to the World Council of Churches Assembly to join that process. So they did, and they asked Rogatam Shana to become the executive on economic justice in Geneva. And then in the year 2000, the Lutheran World Federation called Karin Blomqvist, whom you might know. Karin Blomqvist, a Lutheran theologian, now retired, living in California. And so the three organizations then developed a common program for the 2000 years, yes, 2000 to 2010. But the first was the Lutheran World Federation in 23, calling this Washington Consensus idolatry. Then 2004, a kind of confession, the Accra Confession of the World Alliance of Reformed Churches. And then the Western churches, particularly Germany and Switzerland, stopped the World Council following the same line. So in 2006 in Porto Alegre, they could not follow. But in 2013, in Busan, there were the clear decisions against imperial capitalism in different decisions. So 30 years of work, 83 to November 2013, was the work on the economy of life and rejection of imperial capitalism. Now, the wonderful thing was 2 weeks later, and that is new, that is not in my book because it was published in 12 and in 13. 2 weeks later after Busan, the Pope published his book, I mean, his apostolic letter on Evangelii Gaudium.
Yes.
Where he said, this economy kills, and therefore no to the idolatry of money, etc., etc., etc. So since that time, we have a church historic unity between Reformation churches, Orthodox churches, and the Pope, which is absolutely remarkable. Being internationally clear on that point. Of course, not all the local churches followed, as you know, because particularly in the global north, you wouldn't find many churches who have followed that line and made clear decisions along these lines. But we are still working on that, and I'm sure you are. So I think this is very important to understand this extraordinary church historic event to have all these churches together, rejecting imperial capitalism and working at alternatives. This is absolutely great, and I'm very happy about it, as you can imagine. Now, just briefly, the Pope every year meets with the social movements. I don't know whether you are aware of that. Yes. He has a new unit in the Vatican, which is on integral human development. And a fantastic cardinal is heading that unit, Turkson by name. And they have, in one way or another, meetings every year with the social movements. So as you say, the World Social Forum, because of Corona, couldn't meet for 2 years. But you have those meetings of the social movements, and in one way or another, the Vatican linking to it. Unfortunately, the World Council of Churches, I come back to that, it does not any longer have that kind of presence like we had when the social forums were meeting. Right. We were there with 1,000 people of the ecumenical movement in the world. I mean, when Rogate Mshana was still the executive on economic justice, we were 1,000 people from the churches and the ecumenical grassroots, together with the World Social Forums meetings in different places. So that is one important thing, that the Pope keeps that tradition, which unfortunately, because of Corona, is not fully lived out at the present time in terms of all the churches. But you have another element of that in the Christian community, and that is, I don't know whether you are aware, there is a coalition of World Council, Lutheran World Federation, now World Communion of Reformed Churches, not anymore Alliance, and the Council for World Mission, CWM. Yeah. They have a common initiative, NIFEA. Are you aware of that?
I'm not, no.
Yes, you can link, you can find it on the internet. That is a new international financial and economic architecture, NIFEA. Yes, and NIFEA has now a very important campaign going on. And we as Kairos Europe in Germany are very much involved in this. We have published manuals, etc. And that is called the Zacchaeus campaign, linking to the tribute collector, yes, in Jesus' time, and Jesus meets him, and he converts and says, "I will give back 4 times of what I stole from the people," etc. So I mean, it's a whole program over several years, but at the present time, the key element of it is Zacchaeus campaign, which is for tax justice. Because when it comes to the kind of wealth accumulation, at the same time as it is in the systemic production system, that it is, I mean, splitting society between labor and capital, and also unemployed and excluded people. But you can at least do a little bit by having a kind of redistribution top down, whereas now it is a bottom up distribution of the tax system. So therefore the tax system is a very, very important element also for financing alternatives, for financing ecological projects, etc., etc. So the tax question is an absolutely key question for the ecumenical. Now I'm very short because it gets too long. The other religions, you have the Buddhism, you have the International Network of Engaged Buddhists, which I also showed in the book. And you have also progressive Islam and Muslim liberation theology. You know, I don't think I already quoted it. I mean, the common word, maybe I did already, because also the hierarchy of Islam stood up for justice. I mean, so in all these different communities, you find elements and movements and paths, and building coalitions among them is very crucial. Now, in terms of the signs of hope for us here, I don't know how in USA, Fridays for Future is the biggest sign of hope, because after the student generation somehow had itself, at least in Germany, I don't know, of course, your university is certainly much better, but in Germany, the general situation was the students are just out to get a job, not to get out of their way, just look for nice grades and so on in order to get a job. So somehow they subjected themselves to the system. Whereas now the young pupils of the schools, yes, have understood their future is being destroyed.
Yeah.
That is great. And what is important in terms, because you are asking what are new signs of hope. The community of scientists has already linked up with Fridays for Future, called Scientists for Future. And what is in relation to your special field, labor unions have now linked up with Fridays for Future. And of course, the labor unions are a problem in themselves, because like the churches, they look to their own advantages of the members of forgetting about the unemployed, etc., and also of ecology. But there are cells in our trade unions, I'm sure in the United States, called Unions for Future. Zukunftsforum, I mean, for instance, near my town, Mannheim, we are already for years working together with Future Forum in the trade unions. So they also are linking up. And of course, and I don't know whether you know, we have in Europe ATTAC, which was, for Germany, Kairos Europe co-founded together with WEED, World Economy, Ecology, Development. And so also, this is a kind of globalization critique network. And I was until we have also an academic council of the movement, etc. So we also link up with Fridays for Future, which means you have a kind of big alliance, and there are other similar attempts to have this big alliance. The one is called unteilbar in German, which is undivisible. Undivisible. And so you have large alliances, including the church agencies like Bread for the World, etc. So it is still not enough, but a sign of hope it is.